Hello, my friends. This is Lynda Lippin, and welcome to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Well, hello, and welcome back one more time to the Pilates Goddess podcast. This is your host, Lynda Lippin, and today, as promised on Tuesday, we are going to be discussing sacroiliac instability. Now, sacroiliac instability is something that I have. I tend to be very hypermobile. I have had a few falls, a few car accidents, and my sacroiliac joint moves way too much. I also, for many, many years, did a lot of the Pilates flexion exercises and yoga exercises, and I did them a little too much and too often. And I did them with a lot of posterior pelvic tilt and a lot of movement through my pelvis in a way that wasn't really healthy. In addition, I've had multiple abdominal laparoscopies followed by a total abdominal hysterectomy. So there's just been a lot going on in that whole area for basically my entire life. And interestingly enough, because we often get handed clients who are very similar to us, I have a lot of clients who are hypermobile and who have also sacroiliac instability. So, like last time, we're going to start by just discussing what the anatomy looks like. And really, what we're talking about when we talk about SI instability and how to deal with it in our own bodies and in our clients' bodies. Okay. Now, once again, sacroiliac instability or an unstable pelvis is something that I see brought up in groups of Pilates professionals several times a week. And some of it is client driven. So people have, clients coming in who have an unstable sacroiliac joint and need help. Or it's teachers who are watching a client move and listening to kind of a client's pain history and thinking, I wonder if that's sacroiliac instability. So let's talk for a minute about the anatomy of the area. All right. So your pelvis is not one solid bone. Your pelvis actually has two halves. And if you think about it, it kind of needs that because of the structure of your sacrum and the spine. So each half of your pelvis, which is also known as an innominate, I love that word. I don't know why, but ever since I learned it, I love it. But the halves of your pelvis are joined together in the back at your sacrum at what's called the sacroiliac joint. Now, this is a mobile yet stable joint. There's a whole lot of connective tissue that are holding your pelvis, two halves of your pelvis together on each side of your sacrum. In the front of the body, the two halves of the pelvis come together at the pubis symphysis, which we often just call the pubic bone, but it's really not the pubic bone, it's the pubic bones, because it's where the two halves come together, and there's actually a little disc in between the two that's very similar to the discs that we have in our spine that helps kind of cushion things and, where the two meet in front. If you have ever had your SI joint, your sacroiliac joint, adjusted by an osteopath or a chiropractor, you might know that oftentimes you don't necessarily feel the adjustment happening at your sacrum, but you will feel the pop or movement in the pubis symphysis, right? And this makes sense because the back of your pelvis and the front of your pelvis on each side is the same bone. There's a right half and a left half. So, of course, there is a ridiculous amount of muscle and connective tissue around this whole area of the pelvis and the sacrum to help us stabilize things. But, you can have, like I do, hypermobility. People can fall, be in car accidents, have, one half of the pelvis rotate. Sometimes one half of the pelvis gets jammed up or jammed forward or jammed backward a little bit. And when this happens, it can cause quite a bit of pain and inflammation. The issue is that the pain and inflammation from sacroiliac instability can often feel in the body the same way that a psoas strain might, the same way as bursitis in the hip might, the same way sometimes as a disc herniation or something going on in the lumbar spine might. So, unless folks really have been diagnosed by a physician, I wouldn't necessarily trust their intuitive sense that they have sacroiliac instability. Okay. And I don't mean to sound, remotely condescending, because a lot of times we do have a good sense of what's going on in our bodies. But I know from personal experience in both my own body and my clients' bodies and my friends' bodies that, especially in an area like the pelvis, where you have a lot of organs, you have a lot of muscles, and you've got the spine and the pelvis, that there can be a whole lot of things going on down there that can feel inside relevantly similar, even though they have very different causes. In fact, when I'm not doing a lot of my own exercise in my own Pilates and my pelvis gets a little jammed on one side, I will get nerve pain and weakness down my leg that is, relevantly similar to the pain that I've had from having shingles on my right sciatic nerve many times, because the sciatic nerve does run through that sacroiliac space. And yeah, so those things can feel relevantly similar. Again, different causes and different things that you want to do for that area. So once you kind of understand what sacroiliac instability is and where that sacroiliac instability lies in the body, and that is typically going to be then where you have, overstretched ligaments on one side or both sides. And so you have just a little too much movement going forward and backward, up and down, and in rotation. Folks can also have pain around the sacroiliac joint caused by impact. Sometimes runners will have issues with their sacroiliac joints. Cyclists can have issues with their sacroiliac joints. Spin instructors tend to have a lot of issues in their SI joints just because of the nature of what they do in the position that they're in most of the time. Okay. So once you know that for sure that the issue is the sacroiliac joint, what do you do? Well, first I'm going to start by telling you what you're not going to do. Okay? The first thing that you're not going to do is work on a lot of deep stretching and mobility around the pelvis. Because I can almost guarantee you that somebody who has some sacroiliac joint dysfunction also feels some stuff around the psoas. I can almost guarantee you that they might have some pain in the buttocks and down the leg that may be very reminiscent of sciatic pain and maybe disc herniation pain if they've had that before. So what you're going to do is not do a lot of pelvic mobility work and a lot of stretching work. What you're going to try to do is get clients as stable as they can around that pelvis and the SI joint, and then work at the thigh joint, at the hip joint, work the legs, work the torso, work the body, doing as little lower back and pelvic movement as possible. The other thing that you're really not going to do is you're not going to cue clients with unstable sacroiliac joints to scoop and pull their hip bones together as they go into any kind of spinal flexion. Because what's going to happen is that cueing separates that joint a little bit more. So if it's already unstable and if it's already potentially moving a lot, moving more than it should, then adding a kind of tightening at the hip bones and a more of a stretching into that area is actually going to make things worse at the end of the day for your client. So if you think about sacroiliac support belts, if you've ever had a client wear one of those, which is essentially like a tight elastic that wraps around the pelvic area by the sacrum, what I want you to picture in your mind is what kind of strengthening work you would want to do to mimic what that support belt is doing. That will again mean a lot of balanced strengthening work around the legs, around the glutes, around the hips, around the pelvis, and around the lower back. Where these clients are going to get worse. And the problem here is that when you're unstable in an area, as we know, things get tight around it. So your client's feeling tight. And your client really, really wants to stretch. And when I feel tight around my sacrum and my lower back area, and I have access to a full Pilates studio, then it might seem natural that I might pick some exercises like short spine, like tower, like rolling, like long spine. Although for me, long spine tends to be better than short spine. I can also tell you that personally, when I go to do those exercises, that while I'm doing them, they feel fabulous. It's only a few hours later when I start having the burning nerve pain and more inflammation that I realize that in doing those inversions and that deep stretching through my sacrum and the bottom and back of my pelvis, that what I have done is overstretch the area that is already unstable and made things even worse. So, what you are going to want to really look at with clients with instability is getting them as stable as possible. And once again, how are you going to do that? Well, it's relevantly similar to what we talked about with psoas tightness and working with the hip flexors. Okay. You are going to have your clients stay heavy in their sacrums and wide across their hip bones with a long, lifted, extended spine. We're not going to talk about neutral spine because I don't go there. And if you want to know why, go back. I believe it's episode 1 is the myth of neutral spine. So you can hear what I have to say about that if you haven't yet. Along with that heavy sacrum, cue your clients to keep their hip bones wide and heavy. Wide and heavy. They can still engage their abdominals. They can still move through a little lumbar flexion and extension. But if you get a sense of keeping the hip bones wide and heavy, there's going to be less movement at the sacroiliac joint. And again, a little bit more stability. Again, you want to look at the outer hip and the inner thigh. Again, we want to look at strengthening in extension and maybe small hyperextensions without shoving the pelvis forward or pushing the pelvis anywhere. Because another thing that will happen with sacroiliac instability is that your clients may have pain with hyperextension because there's going to be a tendency to want to kind of push the sacrum forward and lift out of that. And that's going to put some tension and inflammation into that sacroiliac joint. You are going to want to basically strengthen all around there, strengthening the glutes, strengthening the glute medius, strengthening the TFL, strengthening the lower back muscles, okay? Strengthening the hip flexors, strengthening the extensors, and of course, strengthening the whole powerhouse. As your client gets better, I can almost guarantee that they're going to go back and they're going to want to do the short spine again. And they're going to want to do the tower again because now they feel better and like they can. And in general, I say no. Because in my own experience, when I go through that and I'm finally feeling better, then I go to do some deep lumbar and pelvic flexion situation, and I am right back in that pain. If you're working in a full studio, there are some great, exercises that you can take your client into that are more advanced that will still work them in, all of their stability. All of the long stretches are actually going to be great for them. You just want to watch that they don't dip the pelvis too far down on the upstretch, right? And that they're nice and supported on the downstretch. But really, what you're looking at is pelvic stabilization. If you go on to my YouTube channel, and I'll actually put a link to it in the show notes, I have an entire short video on pelvic stability and why pelvic stability is important. This will also help you reconnect to the hip flexor discussion that we had on Tuesday. Sacroiliac dysfunction is painful. Sacroiliac instability is painful. And somehow we all got it into our heads at some point that painful things should just be stretched and then they'll feel better. But that is really, 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 really not the case. It is not the case. Most of the time, in my experience, and again, this is my experience. And it's been 34 years. I've worked in many places. I've won many awards. I've done all the things. But in my experience, working on pelvic stability, on lumbar stability, and on a lot of hip and thigh and glute and abdominal strength is not going to hurt anybody. Okay. That is the work that's going to help your clients feel better and get kind of a deeper understanding of what's happening when they're feeling pain around their lower backs and around their pelvises. So I hope you found this helpful. I see so many teachers getting really worried and really concerned about the tight hip flexors, really worried and concerned about the unstable pelvises and the sacroiliac instability. And some of that is because some of us come to this very much in all of our clients are tight and need stretching mindset. And while I agree that a lot of clients do need some mobility work, if you start working on stretch and mobility before your client is stable, then there's going to be a tendency for them to overstretch the areas where they're very mobile and get even tighter in the areas where they're tight. Whereas if you work on some balanced strength, in good ranges of motion. And again, for me, it's going to be a lot of footwork. It's going to be a lot of bridging work. It's all of that those clients are going to feel and function better. They are, because they're going to start to be able to pull themselves together and not just be moving when they're not even aware that they're moving in a way that's painful or harmful, or will be painful or harmful a few hours later. Because note that especially with sacroiliac instability, your client might feel really, really great after they do the stretch in your studio. And it's not until they get home a few hours later that the pain sets in. Okay, remember that your clients need to be able to walk out of your studio and do things in their lives. They're picking up their kids, they're going back to work, they're traveling, they're carrying shit, they're going grocery shopping. They got to do stuff. Okay, so we need them to leave being as functional as they were when they came in. Every single exercise and variation and modification that I discussed in the last episode is appropriate for your clients with sacroiliac instability. Okay? Any instability in the area needs to be countered by work on stabilization. So as always, I hope you found this helpful. As always, I would love it if you reached out and let me know your opinion or had a conversation with me. And as always, I thank you so, so much for listening to the podcast. I thank you to everybody who has rated or reviewed. If you have not yet, if you would please go to the Apple Podcasts app or Spotify or Podchaser and leave a rating. And if you can, a written review. Subscribe to the podcast. I would deeply, deeply appreciate it. It really does help. Have a great rest of your week, and I will talk to you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Music brought to you by Nerd Salad. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, especially if you liked it. And please like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks.